Imagine this. It's one of the world's biggest superstars, a name that dominates headlines, streaming charts, and even cultural conversations suddenly finds his grand project collapsing before the world's eyes. We're talking about none other than Drake, the Toronto giant whose every move sets the internet on fire. His much-hyped Iceman project, a venture that promised to reshape not only the music industry but also entertainment as a whole, has now been officially scrapped. Yes, you heard it right, the project that had fans buzzing, insiders speculating, and the media circling like vultures is gone before it could even properly launch. But what does this really mean? For Drake, it's a massive blow. For his legacy, it's a new question mark. And for the rap game, it's a signal that even the biggest names are not immune to collapse. The Iceman project wasn't just another album or side hustle. It was designed to be a statement, a symbol of dominance, and a way for Drake to remind the world that he still controls the narrative. Yet, here we are, talking about its demise. Now, here's where it gets even more interesting. Kendrick Lamar, Drake's long-standing rival, lyrical opponent, and perhaps the one artist who can truly shake him, hasn't stayed silent. Kendrick's reaction to this collapse has become a talking point in itself. Fans have been dissecting every word, every gesture, and every subtle message from Kendrick, wondering whether this was just a casual observation or a calculated jab. At his rival's downfall, think about it. Two of hip-hop's greatest figures, locked in a cold war for supremacy, and one of them just suffered a high-profile failure. You don't need to be a genius to know this changes the game. Is Kendrick celebrating quietly? Is he using this moment to remind Drake that dominance isn't permanent? Or is he sending a warning that his own empire is built differently, built to last? Tonight, we're diving deep. From the roots of the Iceman project and why it was supposed to be so groundbreaking, to the reasons behind its collapse, and of course, Kendrick's sharp, layered response, we're about to unpack one of the most shocking twists in hip-hop this year. So sit tight, because this story has everything: ambition, rivalry, collapse, and the kind of reaction only Kendrick Lamar can deliver. When we talk about Drake, we aren't just talking about a rapper. We're talking about a cultural phenomenon, from mixtapes in Toronto basements to selling out stadiums across the globe. Drake has built an empire unlike anything hip-hop has ever seen. Every album feels like an event. Every single becomes a chart topper, and every move sparks conversations that go far beyond music. So when whispers of a mysterious new venture codenamed the Iceman Project began to circulate, the world paid attention. The name itself carried weight. Fans speculated endlessly. Was it a new album, a multimedia experience, a fashion line, or even a film project? Drake, being Drake, kept things vague. He teased it on social media with cryptic emojis, icy visuals, and subtle references in interviews. That ambiguity wasn't a flaw, it was part of the strategy. By saying less, he made people want more. And as months passed, anticipation reached fever pitch. According to insiders, Iceman wasn't just another release. It was Drake's attempt to redefine what an artist could be. In 2025, the blueprint reportedly involved a fusion of music, digital storytelling, high-tech collaborations, and experimental fashion drops. Think about how Kanye once blurred the lines between fashion and music, or how Travis Scott merged gaming and live performance with Fortnite. Drake wanted to take that concept even further, creating an ecosystem where music, visuals, and cultural influence collided. The goal was clear: to cement himself not just as the biggest rapper alive, but as an untouchable cultural architect whose brand reached into every corner of entertainment and lifestyle. For a moment, it seemed unstoppable. He had the reach, with a global fan base that transcended language and culture. He had the resources, backed by over a decade of dominance and industry power. And he had the timing, with critics questioning his artistic depth and rivals pushing for relevance. Iceman was his chance to reset the narrative, to silence doubts, and to showcase that he wasn't just surviving in the industry, he was still innovating. People weren't waiting for an album, they were waiting for a cultural earthquake. Some speculated the project would involve AI-driven music videos, interactive concerts, or NFT-style collectibles. Others believed it would be Drake's secret weapon against Kendrick Lamar, proof that he could innovate on a level no one else could touch. And then, suddenly, it all fell apart. One moment, fans were expecting rollout dates and announcements. The next, reports surfaced that the Iceman project had been scrapped entirely. No album, no rollout, no cultural empire. Nothing. The reasons were conflicting. Some said it was too ambitious, that the logistics of combining music, technology, and fashion spiraled out of control. Others pointed to creative disagreements between Drake's camp and external partners. There were even whispers that Drake himself had lost confidence. Realizing that the hype might have outpaced the substance, to casual fans, it was shocking. To insiders, it was a warning sign. Even the biggest superstar on Earth isn't immune to collapse. When ambition collides with reality, this is where the story takes a sharper turn. Because for over a decade, one shadow has followed Drake's seemingly unstoppable rise. Kendrick Lamar. While Drake mastered charts, Kendrick mastered respect. Where Drake delivered hits, Kendrick delivered impact. Where Drake thrived on mainstream attention, Kendrick thrived on cultural depth. So when news of Iceman's collapse broke, the world naturally turned to Kendrick. Would he comment? Would he ignore it? Or would he use the moment to remind everyone that his empire was built differently? Kendrick didn't need to drop a direct diss. A few carefully chosen lines in a freestyle, a smirk in an interview, and subtle references in social posts were enough for fans to connect the dots. To them, Kendrick wasn't just reacting, he was reclaiming the throne. Because here's the truth, when your biggest rival stumbles, it isn't just a headline, it's an opportunity. And Kendrick knows that better than anyone. Drake's downfall. With the Iceman project, didn't happen in isolation. It unfolded against the backdrop of one of hip-hop's most compelling rivalries. For years, fans have debated who truly owns this era, Drake or Kendrick Lamar. On one hand, Drake has spent more than a decade at the top of the charts, crafting hits that dominate radio, playlists, and arenas. On the other hand, Kendrick has carved out a reputation as the conscience of hip-hop, a Pulitzer-winning storyteller. His lyrics cut deeper than any commercial success could measure. Their careers have often felt like parallel lines destined to collide. Whenever Drake scored a chart-topping single, Kendrick answered with a verse that shook the culture. When Kendrick disappeared into silence, Drake filled the void with endless releases, features, and headlines. And yet, underneath all the success, there's always been tension, unspoken but undeniable. That's why the collapse of Iceman felt bigger than just a business failure. For Drake, it wasn't only about losing a project, it was about handing ammunition to the one rival who didn't need much to begin with. Kendrick didn't have to say Drake's name directly. Fans were already doing the work, dissecting every possible sign of a reaction. When Kendrick performed a surprise freestyle at a small venue shortly after the Iceman news broke, a single line set social media ablaze. Castles made of ice melt faster in the sun. He never mentioned Drake. He didn't need to. Within hours, fans clipped the moment, spread it online, and tied it directly to Drake's failed project. It was classic Kendrick, subtle enough to deny, sharp enough to cut. Even in interviews, Kendrick's body language spoke volumes. When asked about the state of hip-hop and the pressures artists face, he smirked before answering, "You can't build forever on shaky foundations." Again, no names. But the implication was clear. Drake's empire, despite its dominance, was showing cracks, and Kendrick was more than willing to let the public connect the dots. For fans, these moments reignited the rivalry in a way no diss track could. They saw Drake scrambling to recover his image while Kendrick played the long game, reminding the culture that true artistry isn't about constant output, it's about timeless impact. Some even argued that ICEMAN's failure proved what Kendrick had been suggesting all along. Drake's dominance was built on spectacle and marketing rather than unshakable artistry. Of course, not everyone agreed. Drake's loyal supporters defended him fiercely, arguing that every visionary stumbles. They pointed out that icons like Kanye West, Jay-Z, and even Michael Jackson had faced public setbacks before rising stronger. Darker rumors, too, whispers of legal issues, mismanaged funds, and even betrayal within his inner circle. Whatever the cause, the result was the same. A superstar who had built a brand on control and dominance suddenly looked vulnerable. Vulnerability isn't something Drake is used to showing, especially in a game where perception often matters more than reality. And that's exactly why Kendrick's reaction, subtle but surgical, cut so deeply. It wasn't just about Iceman. It was about reminding the world that Drake, for all his power, isn't untouchable. Fans began framing the collapse as a symbolic moment. For more than a decade, Drake and Kendrick represented two competing visions of hip-hop. One commercial and melodic, the other conscious and uncompromising. The failure of Iceman felt too many. Like a metaphor, proof that spectacle can collapse under its own weight, while substance endures. It was almost poetic. The man known as the Iceman saw his empire melt, while the man known for fire in his verses stood calmly in the aftermath. But this was just the beginning of the conversation. Because while Kendrick was subtle in his reaction, the bigger question became, how would Drake respond? Would he double down and try to reclaim momentum with another massive project? Or would he retreat, regroup, and accept that even superstars have limits? The answers weren't clear yet. But what was certain was that Iceman's collapse had shifted the balance of their rivalry. Drake had stumbled in a way that couldn't be hidden, and Kendrick had seized the moment without even breaking a sweat. In hip-hop, perception is everything. And right now, perception was tilting in Kendrick's favor. When news of Iceman's collapse spread across social media, the reaction was immediate and brutal. Memes flooded Twitter within hours, painting Drake as a king whose empire had crumbled under its own weight. TikTok edits mocked the project's name, overlaying melting ice cubes with Drake's most emotional lyrics. For an artist who thrived on image and perception, this was a nightmare. Drake has always been more than just his music. He's been a master of narrative control. Whether it was flipping heartbreak into relatable anthems or turning his own memes into branding tools, he had a way of spinning every moment into fuel. But Iceman felt different. This wasn't a quirky viral joke he could embrace. It was a high-profile failure tied directly to his ambition. For the first time in years, the internet wasn't laughing with Drake, it was laughing at him. Inside his camp, the pressure mounted. Sources close to OVO suggested long meetings, frantic calls, and a growing sense of urgency. Some advised Drake to immediately pivot, to drop new music and redirect the conversation. Others believed he needed to lay low, let the storm pass, and return with something undeniable later. But Drake isn't built to disappear. He knows that silence creates space, and in that space, rivals like Kendrick thrive. So he tried to control the narrative. On Instagram Live, Drake downplayed the failure, framing Iceman as just one idea among many. He reminded fans of his track record, listing off milestones and achievements as proof that one stumble couldn't define him. His tone was calm, but the subtext was clear. He wanted people to see him as untouchable, resilient, still in control. Yet, too many felt defensive. a superstar explaining himself in a way that hinted at vulnerability. The media, of course, circled like sharks. Blogs and podcasts dissected every word of his livestream. Headlines read, "Drake spins Iceman collapse and is the sixth god finally slipping." Industry analysts debated whether the project's failure marked the beginning of a downward trajectory or simply a bump in an otherwise flawless run. Even late-night talk shows jumped in, with comedians turning Iceman into punchlines. The story wasn't just about music anymore. It had become a cultural event. Meanwhile, fans were split. For some, the collapse didn't matter. To them, Drake's music catalog was proof enough of his greatness. They argued that anyone pushing boundaries is bound to fail sometimes. At least he tried something new, one fan tweeted. Kendrick drops once every 5 years. Drake takes risks every year. These loyalists framed Iceman as a bold experiment that simply didn't land, not a career-defining failure. But others weren't so forgiving. Critics who had long accused Drake of prioritizing spectacle over substance now had fresh ammunition. To them, Iceman was proof that he had lost touch with the art, chasing empire building rather than artistry. They pointed to Kendrick's consistency in delivering culturally impactful projects as the opposite model: quality over quantity, depth over hype. In their eyes, Drake's stumble wasn't just a failed project, it was symbolic of a deeper decline. Kendrick's shadow loomed larger through all of this. Every joke, every meme, every headline seemed to carry the unspoken comparison. Drake had swung big and missed, while Kendrick stood silently, letting the world interpret his few cryptic lines as confirmation of his superiority. Even artists outside the rivalry chimed in subtly. Some posted icy emojis with laughing faces, while others dropped subliminal comments about integrity and authentic art. It was open season, and Drake was the target. Yet, if there's one thing history has shown, it's that Drake is a master of comebacks. This wasn't the first time he'd been counted out. From the Meek Mill feud that threatened to derail his reputation to the constant accusations of ghostwriting, he has always found a way to flip narratives back in his favor. ICEP's collapse was devastating, but it also set the stage for what could be his most important comeback yet. The question was how? Would he go back to his roots, crafting an album as raw and personal as Take Care to remind fans of his artistry? Would he embrace the failure, weaving it into his music as another chapter in his story of resilience? Or would he double down on spectacle, determined to prove that Iceman was just the beginning of an even bigger vision? The answers weren't clear yet, but the world was watching. Every move, every post, every lyric was now under a microscope. For once, Drake wasn't dictating the conversation. He was reacting to it. And in a rivalry where perception often matters more than reality, that shift was monumental. Kendrick didn't need to release a song, call out Drake directly, or even address the collapse head-on. By simply existing as the alternative, the artist who hadn't stumbled, he looked stronger. In many ways, Drake's attempt to expand his empire with Iceman had backfired, not just because it failed, but because it made Kendrick's minimalist, substance-driven approach looked even more powerful by contrast. For Drake, the stakes had never been higher. The collapse of Iceman wasn't the end of his career, but it was a crack in his armor. And once the world sees a crack, they start looking for more. Kendrick Lamar has never been the kind of artist who moves recklessly. Where Drake thrives on constant output, Kendrick thrives on patience. Where Drake embraces spectacle, Kendrick chooses silence until the moment demands otherwise. That's why his response to the collapse of Drake's Iceman project hit so hard. Not because he shouted, but because he whispered. In the days after the news broke, fans scoured Kendrick's every move. They replayed his surprise freestyle, where he dropped the line, "Castles made of ice melt faster in the sun." He didn't mention names, he didn't need to. For an audience already primed by years of rivalry, the metaphor was too sharp to ignore. Drake had just lost a project named Iceman. Kendrick had just talked about ice melting. The internet did the rest. The power of Kendrick's words lies in their ambiguity. He's always understood that leaving space for interpretation makes his message even stronger. Instead of calling Drake out directly, he lets fans and critics connect the dots, turning speculation into narrative. By doing so, he avoids looking petty while still delivering a sting sharp enough to trend worldwide. It's a strategy he's used before, and in the aftermath of Iceman's collapse, it worked perfectly. But his reaction wasn't only verbal. His body language spoke just as loudly. In a sit-down interview days later, a journalist asked Kendrick about the pressures of being an artist at the top. He paused, smirked, and said calmly, "You can't build forever on shaky foundations." No names again, but the meaning was undeniable. Drake had built an empire on constant output and spectacle, and now one of those spectacles had collapsed. Kendrick, the artist who disappears for years at a time, yet returns with cultural earthquakes, was subtly positioning himself as the opposite. Fans ate it up. Twitter lit up with comparisons, memes, and debates. Some argued Kendrick was exposing Drake's weaknesses without lifting a finger. Others claimed he was simply stating truths about the industry that just happened to align with Drake's situation. Either way, the cultural takeaway was the same. Kendrick looked composed, untouchable, and prophetic, while Drake looked reactionary. What makes Kendrick's reaction so devastating is that it played into his long-standing image. He has always been painted as the artist of depth and integrity, the one who doesn't chase trends but sets standards. By letting Drake's Iceman collapse speak for itself, Kendrick reinforced the contrast without even releasing new music. It was the ultimate example of less is more. In hip-hop, silence is rarely seen as strength. The culture is built on bravado, on loud declarations of dominance. Wait when he does choose to speak. In this case, a single metaphor about melting ice carried more cultural impact than any full diss record could have. The cultural symbolism was too rich to ignore. Drake had branded himself as Iceman, projecting cold dominance, untouchability, and control. Yet, his project melted away before the public's eyes. Kendrick, the artist often associated with fire. Fire in his verses, fire in his delivery, fire in his imagery, stood by as the ice dissolved. It was almost poetic. The fire didn't need to attack the ice. The sun itself did the work. Kendrick just had to point it out. Meanwhile, critics praised Kendrick's restraint. Think pieces appeared in music journals, arguing that his approach showed why he remained one of the most respected voices in the game. One writer noted, "Drake builds hype. Kendrick builds legacy." Another wrote, "Drake's Iceman was designed to be a cultural event, but Kendrick's reaction became the real event." The collapse of Iceman might have been Drake's failure, but Kendrick's response turned it into Kendrick's victory. Even within the industry, other artists took notice. Some subtly aligned themselves with Kendrick, reposting his freestyle clips or echoing his themes about foundations and authenticity. For those tired of Drake's dominance, Iceman's collapse felt like an opening. And Kendrick's cool, understated presence made him the natural leader of that narrative. Of course, not everyone saw it as a clean win. Some argued that Kendrick was playing it safe, that by refusing to address Drake directly, he avoided real confrontation. But that critique ignored the bigger picture. Kendrick didn't need confrontation this time. The moment itself was enough. Drake's stumble did the heavy lifting, and Kendrick's role was simply to highlight it with precision. For fans, the reaction deepened the rivalry. This wasn't just about music anymore. It was about philosophy. Drake represented constant Output, endless content, the hustle of staying visible. Kendrick represented scarcity, substance, and carefully chosen words. Iceman's failure and Kendrick's reaction to it turned their differences into a cultural lesson. One approach looked fragile under pressure, while the other seemed timeless. The irony was clear. Drake had spent years positioning himself as the one in control of the narrative. But in this moment, he wasn't telling the story anymore. Kendrick was. And he didn't even have to raise his voice. The collapse of the Iceman project may feel like the end of something. But in hip-hop, endings are rarely permanent. They are chapters, moments in time that reshape the narrative before the next big move. For Drake, this chapter will go down as one of his most humbling. For Kendrick, it will be remembered as one of his most subtle victories. But the rivalry isn't over, not even close. If history has taught us anything, it's that Drake has a way of turning losses into fuel. The Meek Mill feud should have ended his reign, but he flipped it into some of the most iconic diss tracks of his career. Ghostwriting accusations could have destroyed his credibility, yet he weathered the storm and stayed on top of the charts. Drake thrives on adversity because it gives him something to prove. And right now, after Iceman, he has more to prove than ever. Insiders close to OVO suggest that Drake has already shifted gears. There are whispers of a Back to Basics album, a project designed to remind the world of his artistry rather than his spectacle. Something raw, emotional, and stripped of the corporate sheen that weighed Iceman down. If he delivers that, fans might see this stumble not as a downfall, but as the start of a new chapter where Drake reconnects with the hunger that first made him great. But the risk remains. The cultural memory of Iceman won't disappear easily. In an era where perception often matters more than reality, Drake will have to fight harder than ever to control the narrative. Every misstep will now be magnified, every silence compared to Kendrick's calm composure. The weight of expectations has never been heavier. Kendrick, meanwhile, sits in a position of quiet power. By doing so little, he managed to gain so much. His restraint made him look like the artist who didn't need spectacle to stay relevant, the one whose words echo longer than Drake's projects. And with rumors that Kendrick is working on new material of his own, the timing couldn't be better. If he drops a project in the aftermath of Iceman's collapse, the cultural impact could be seismic. Fans would see it as the ultimate contrast, one giant falling, another rising. Yet perhaps the most fascinating part of this story is how it reflects hip-hop itself. The genre has always thrived on rivalry, on the push and pull between egos, visions, and legacies. Drake and Kendrick represent two different philosophies of artistry, and Iceman's collapse turned their rivalry into a cultural lesson. One side showed the risks of overreaching, while the other showed the power of patience. But make no mistake, the story is far from finished. Rivalries in hip-hop don't end with a single moment. They evolve, they twist, they resurface when you least expect them. Today, Kendrick looks stronger. Tomorrow, Drake could drop something that flips the conversation all over again. That unpredictability is what makes this rivalry so magnetic and why fans can't stop watching.